I was 17 stories up the amber wall's western face when the long-range alert sounded, and the first thing I remember thinking was how ordinary the morning had been until that moment. The scaffolding crane I was riding had just locked into position over Buttress 9, one of the 400 primary load-bearing columns that held the amber wall's upper terrace above the Pacific Shelf. I had a flask of coffee in my left hand and a structural integrity report on my tablet in my right, and the wind was coming off the water at 11 knots, which was pleasant for that latitude. Gulls were working the updraft along the wall's face, riding the thermal column that the amber wall's heat exchangers push out every morning as the sun hits the western plating. A maintenance day, a Tuesday. The kind of shift where the biggest decision you expect to make is whether to recalibrate an expansion joint or flag it for the next crew. Then the tone came through every speaker on the wall and every personal comm and every hardline channel simultaneously, and the coffee went cold in my hand because I forgot I was holding it. I should explain what the amber wall is, because if you haven't stood on it, the word wall gives you the wrong picture. It is not a wall. It is a city turned sideways and fused to the continental shelf. 4,000 kilometers of engineered coastline running from what used to be called the Aleutian Shelf all the way down to the old Baja Fracture Zone, and it is not merely tall, it is deep. The amber wall extends 900 meters below sea level and 340 meters above it, and its internal volume houses manufactories, residential tiers, desalination arrays, atmospheric processors, defense grid anchorages, materials labs, transit spines, and more infrastructure than most nations had in the century I was born. 17 million people live inside it. Another 40 million live in the tiered cities that cascade eastward from its landward face, sheltered by its mass. I have spent 31 years as a structural engineer inside its body. I know its weight distributions the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every stress fracture, every expansion joint, every tremor in the deep rock pilings. I feel them through the floor when I walk the inspection corridors before dawn. I know which sections groan during a Pacific swell and which ones sing. I know the exact pitch of the harmonic that runs through Buttress 9 when the thermal cycle peaks. The amber wall is not a thing I work on. It is a thing I live inside of, and it is alive in the way that only very large, very old, very carefully maintained structures are alive, not with thought, but with momentum. It was built to last. That is the part that matters for what I'm about to tell you. For the Salathi, not specifically. It was built because 200,000 years ago, something came to Earth and took what it wanted, and the species that survived, that taking decided, collectively, patiently, across more generations than most civilizations endure, that nothing would ever take from this world again without permission. The wall is one expression of that decision. There are others, the orbital grid, the atmospheric fleet, the archive at Sverdlovsk, the deep rock resonance network that threads the planet's mantle like a nervous system listening for vibrations that don't belong. But the amber wall is the one I know, the one I have given my career to, so it is the one I will tell you about. The alert was a Rannoch 4 designation, which meant unidentified mass transit above the orbital threshold, inbound and decelerating. I had never heard a Rannoch 4 in my career. I had drilled for one. Every engineer on the wall drills for one during their first year, then every 5 years afterward. But I had always assumed, the way most people assume about fire drills and lifeboat stations, that the real thing would never come. The drills were thorough and professional and treated with genuine seriousness, because we are a serious people when it comes to readiness. but there was always an unspoken understanding beneath them. This is the rehearsal for a show that closed 200,000 years ago. I set the coffee down on the crane platform's railing and watched the status feed scroll across my tablet. The numbers were calm. That was the strange part, or rather, the part that reminded me what kind of civilization I lived in. The automated defense grid had already registered the inbound signatures, classified them, cross-referenced them against the deep archive, and begun cycling its response protocols, all in the time it took me to blink twice. There was no panic anywhere in the data, no alarm escalation, no emergency routing. The amber wall's seismic dampeners hadn't even shifted mode. The atmospheric fleet above us, I could see 3 of the big Kessler-class warships from my position, each one a little over 4 kilometers long, hanging in the sky, like geometry given permission to float. Had altered course by fractions of a degree. Their running lights hadn't changed color. Their weapons bays hadn't opened. I remember looking up at the nearest Kessler, the Ven Sural, and thinking, you were built for this exact morning, and you don't even look like you've noticed. That is what 200,000 years of readiness looks like. Not scrambling, not reacting, adjusting, the way a large animal adjusts when a smaller one enters its territory. A shift in weight, a turn of the head, nothing more. The Salathi fleet entered visual range 41 minutes later. I want to be precise about what I saw, because precision matters when you are talking about something that last happened to this planet 200 millennia ago. The fleet was not large by our standards, 63 vessels, the biggest of which was maybe a 1.5 kilometers from bow to drive assembly, a significant ship by most galactic measures. But I was looking at it from a platform attached to a megastructure that ran 4,000 kilometers along a continental shelf beneath 3 warships, each 3 times its size. Scale is relative. What struck me more than their size was their condition. These were working ships. Their hulls were scarred and patched, not from combat but from use, docking burns, micro-impact pitting, the accumulated weathering of long transits between systems. Industrial hulls, most of them, boxy, functional, heavy forward plating on some, open-frame cargo gantries on others. A few escort craft that were clearly armed, but not in the way you arm something for a real fight, more in the way you arm a truck that drives through a rough district. Deterrent weapons. Warning shot weapons. The kind of armament that says we can defend ourselves if something small and desperate tries to interfere with our work, but nothing more ambitious than that. They were a salvage fleet. That was obvious from their silhouettes. They had come to strip something. I pulled up the deep archive cross-reference on my tablet and read the summary while the fleet was still decelerating into high orbit. The Salathi, a resource extraction collective that had operated across this arm of the galaxy for longer than most species had records. 212,000 years ago, by our calendar, a Salathi extraction group had arrived on Earth, surveyed the mineral content of the crust and upper mantle, established 17 primary extraction sites across 4 continents, and begun removing material. They operated for approximately 1,100 years. They took iridium, palladium, rare earths, deep mantle silicates, and several isotopes that didn't have human names at the time because the humans alive at the time didn't have isotope science. They destabilized tectonic plates. They contaminated aquifers. They strip-mined 3 continental shelves and left the 4th. This one, the Pacific, partially surveyed but unworked, presumably because they ran out of economic incentive before they got to it. The species that lived here, us, though we were not yet what we are now, were not consulted, We were catalogued, the Salvage assessment, preserved in our archive because we found it carved into a rock face in what is now Central Africa, described the indigenous population as a promising carbon-based generalist unlikely to survive the extraction period. They were nearly right. We nearly didn't survive it. The archive estimates that the human population dropped below 40,000 during the worst of the extraction years. Scattered, starving, watching their continents be dismantled from below. 40,000 on an entire planet, while an alien industrial operation tore the ground out from under them and catalogued them as incidental fauna. Entire river systems went dry. Coastlines shifted. The sky carried particulates for decades after the deepest extraction boreholes were opened. People died not from direct violence. The Salvage were not violent toward us. The way a logging crew is not violent toward the birds in the canopy, but from the secondary effects of having their world restructured around them for someone else's inventory. But 40,000 is not zero, and the ones who survived remembered what had been done to them. Not in writing, not at first, but in oral tradition, in cultural memory, in the deep structures of a civilization that rebuilt it itself with a specific and patient purpose. The earliest post-extraction settlements, the archive tells us, were built on the edges of old extraction sites, not by accident, by choice. They built where the scars were deepest, so they would never stop seeing them. We would not be caught like that again. 200,000 years is a long time. I won't pretend I can feel that span the way I feel the weight of the amber wall in my bones. No human mind can hold that much time and make it real. But I can tell you what it produced, because I was standing in the middle of it. The amber wall, the atmospheric fleet, the orbital grid, 640 defense platforms in layered geosynchronous orbits, each one capable of interdicting an incoming fleet at ranges that would make the Salvage's navigational instruments stutter. The deep archive at Sverdlovsk, which contains the complete mineralogical record of every gram removed from this planet during the extraction period, cross-referenced against geological recovery data, cross-referenced against projections of what Earth's crust would have become without intervention, cross-referenced against the Salvage's own assessment carved into that rock face 200 millennia ago. We kept the ledger. Every ton, every scar, every aquifer they poisoned, and we spent centuries healing. Every species we lost to their strip mining, and the millennia it took the ecosystems to rebuild. Not because we were angry. Anger does not survive 200,000 years. But because the record is the foundation of readiness. You cannot prepare for what you do not remember. That is what patience looks like when it has 200,000 years to work with. Not rage, not obsession, maintenance. The Salvage fleet completed its deceleration and settled into a high parking orbit, and, from my position on Buttress 9, I could see them, faintly, as a cluster of dim metallic points against the blue, and I could see the orbital grid around them, and the atmospheric fleet below them, and the amber wall stretching north and south beneath my feet until the curvature of the coast took it beyond sight. And I thought, they have no idea. The comms intercepts started scrolling on my tablet 12 minutes after they achieved orbit. Our signals intelligence had broken their encryption in seconds, not because they had weak encryption, but because we had 200,000 years of baseliner on their communication protocols, starting with the signals their original extraction fleet had used, which we had recorded and preserved. The first exchanges were routine. Arrival confirmations, crew status reports, drive system cooldown logs, resource assessment pings directed at the planet's surface, Standard procedure for a salvage fleet approaching a deposit world. Then the pings came back, and the tone changed. The surface scan returns would have been the first shock. Their instruments were calibrated for a depleted crust. Partial mineral recovery at best, some residual deposits in the unworked Pacific Shelf, atmospheric degradation, consistent with 1100 years of industrial extraction followed by 200 millennia of unmanaged decay. What they got instead was a planet with a fully recovered crust, a stable and actively managed atmosphere, and a surface so densely built that their resource scanners couldn't distinguish the mineral signatures from the structural ones because the minerals had been incorporated into megastructures. I wish I could have been on one of those ships. Not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I have no hatred for the Salathi. I have read their file in the deep archive, and they are not monsters. They are a species that extracts resources, moves on, and does not look back, and by the standards of galactic commerce that is neither unusual nor, in many cases, especially harmful. They process deposit worlds the way a logging concern processes a forest. Professionally, thoroughly, with documentation. They simply never expected the deposit world to be occupied when they returned for a second pass. Most deposit worlds aren't. Most deposit worlds don't have 200,000-year institutional memories. But I would have liked to see the fleet commander's bioluminescent patches. The Salathi have broad, flat faces with color-shifting panels along the jawline that register emotional state. I would have liked to see those patches when the surface scans resolved and the tactical display started populating with things that should not have been there. Cities, warships, defense platforms. A wall that ran 4,000 kilometers along a continental shelf. They had once marked unworked, future extraction pending. The comms intercepts told the story well enough. There was a pause, 4 minutes of absolute radio silence from the fleet, which is a long time when 63 ships are all receiving the same data simultaneously and not one of them has anything to say. Then a burst of internal traffic so dense our analysts had to queue it. Status queries, confirmation requests, sensor recalibrations. They recalibrated their sensors 3 times in 6 minutes because the data coming back did not match the data in their navigational files. Their navigational files said Earth's crust was 34% depleted. Its atmosphere was degraded. Its largest indigenous structures were stone and timber settlements, no taller than 12 meters, and its dominant species had a projected technological ceiling of low orbital, single system pre-contact. That was the entry from 212,000 years ago. That was the last time anyone had looked. What their sensors were telling them now was that the planet below had a population in the tens of billions, a built environment that covered significant fractions of 3 continents, an atmospheric fleet of warships whose individual tonnage exceeded the Salathi fleet's combined displacement, an orbital defense grid that had already, quiet without broadcasting a threat, locked targeting solutions onto every vessel in their formation, and a coastal megastructure along the Pacific Shelf that was, by itself, more massive than anything the Salathi Extraction Collective had ever built in its entire corporate history. I stood on the scaffolding and watched the data feed, and drank my cold coffee and felt something I did not expect to feel, which was sadness. They had come such a long way. Their fleet had crossed real distance. The transit time on those old industrial drives would have been decades, maybe longer, with the crews in some form of suspension. They had filed their flight plan against a 200,000-year-old survey and assumed the numbers were still good. The way you assume a parking lot you used last year will still be a parking lot. They had packed their extraction rigs and their cargo gantries and their deterrent guns and set out to do what their species does, which is take from the empty and move on. And they had arrived at the doorstep of something that was not empty at all. The formal hail came from the orbital grid 40 minutes after the Salathi fleet achieved parking orbit. I listened to the recording afterward. It was broadcast in the clear in Salathi trade standard, which we spoke fluently, having had 200 millennia to practice, and it said, in substance, "This is Earth Orbital Authority. We have identified your fleet composition, drive signatures, and corporate registry. You are flagged in our archive as Salathi Extraction Collective, Clade 7, the same entity that conducted mineral extraction operations on this planet 212,000 years ago. Your extraction license expired upon departure. No renewal has been filed. You are not cleared for orbital station, resource survey, or surface approach. Please confirm your intentions." The fleet commander's response took 9 minutes, which tells you everything about the state of mind aboard those ships. When it came, it was a single sentence in trade standard, and it said, "We were not aware this world was occupied." Earth Orbital Authority's reply was immediate. "It was occupied when you were here last." After that, the comms went dense again. Internal Salathi traffic. Fleet commander to ship captains to crew chiefs to extraction teams who were probably sitting in staging bays next to equipment that would never be unpacked. Our analysts let it flow and translated it in real time. The gist was confusion, disbelief, and a growing current of something that the translation software flagged as status loss distress, the closest Salathi emotional register to what we would call the slow dawning recognition that you are not the largest thing in the room. They had come to strip a corpse, and the corpse was standing in the doorway, and it was taller than they were. The escort phase began 6 hours after the initial hail. I watched it from the Amber Wall's upper terrace, where I had gone after handing off my maintenance shift to a colleague who looked as distracted as I felt. The sky was clear that afternoon, a high, pale blue with thin cirrus at altitude, and the atmospheric fleet had repositioned into a corridor formation, 3 Kessler-class warships flanking a lane of open sky that ran from the orbital threshold down to the horizon line. It was not a combat formation. It was a processional, a courtesy lane, the kind of thing you set up when you want the guests to see the house on the way out. The Salathi fleet descended through it in single file. I want you to understand what that looked like from the ground. 63 industrial vessels, boxy and grey and scarred with decades of transit wear, descending through a lane of open air, flanked by 3 human warships that were each, individually, 3 times the size of the largest Salathi ship. The Kessler-class hulls were dark blue-grey and clean-lined, their surfaces unmarked because they had never been in a fight. They had never needed to be. Their running lights were on, not for navigation, but for visibility, so the Salathi could see them clearly, could see the scale of them, could register in their sensors and their eyes and their bioluminescent jawline patches that the things flanking them were not decorations or bluffs, but 4-kilometer warships built with the resources of a planet that had spent 200 millennia preparing for a morning, exactly like this one. The defense platforms above were visible too, bright points in the daylight sky, steady, patient tracking, and below, the amber wall ran to the horizon in both directions, its upper terrace catching the afternoon sun, its amber-toned plating throwing warm light back into the air. and the megacity tiers behind it rose in cascading terraces that made the Celathi's 12-meter settlement assessment feel like a sentence from another universe. The Salathi fleet did not deviate from the corridor. They did not accelerate. They did not power their deterrent weapons. They descended in a slow, obedient line, and their comms were nearly silent. A colleague of mine, Ravatan, a power systems engineer, who had been on the upper terrace running a capacitor diagnostic when the alert sounded, stood beside me and watched them come down. And she had worked the amber wall for 22 years and had never seen anything larger than a supply hauler in the sky. Now she was watching 63 alien ships file past 3 warships that could have swallowed them whole, and she said something I haven't forgotten. She said, "They packed extraction rigs." Not a question, a statement. She had pulled the same sensor data I had. She knew what was in their cargo bays, equipment for cutting into planetary crust, gantry cranes for lifting ore into orbit, refinery modules, storage rack sized for bulk mineral transport. All of it calibrated for the geological profile of a planet that no longer matched any of their data. A planet whose crust they had once rated 34% depleted, and which now housed the foundations of a civilization that used those same minerals to build the thing they were descending past. I watched the lead Celathi vessel pass below the keel of the Ven Sural, and the size difference was so stark it looked like a workboat passing under a bridge. The Celathi ship's hull was pitted and seam-welded and functional. The Kessler's hull was smooth and continuous, a single engineered surface 4 kilometers long, built with the kind of material science that comes from having access to a fully recovered planetary crust and 200,000 years of uninterrupted research. The contrast was not intentional. No one had designed the escort to humiliate, but it was inescapable. The escort brought them to a holding position 300 kilometers off the coast at 12,000 meters, and there they were met by a diplomatic cutter, a small, fast, unarmed vessel that detached from the Ven Sural and crossed the gap in minutes. Aboard, it was a senior attaché from Earth's External Contact Bureau, a translator who was there more for courtesy than necessity, and a sealed data core. I did not witness the meeting. No one outside the diplomatic cutter did. But the attaché's report was declassified 11 days later, and I read it in full, the way I read structural integrity reports, carefully, noting what was load-bearing and what was cosmetic. The attaché boarded the Celathi flagship, a vessel called, in rough translation, the Grainfather, which tells you something about how they saw this mission, the way a farmer sees a field he intends to harvest, and was received by the fleet commander, a senior Celathi, whose bioluminescent patches were cycling through a color the translation file identified as formal distress. The commander's escort stood behind him in a half-circle, their patches dim, their weapons holstered, their postures carrying the particular stillness of professionals who have realized their equipment is irrelevant. The attaché presented the data core and invited the commander to review it. The data core contained the extraction ledger. Every mine the Celathi had opened on Earth 212,000 years ago, every ton of material removed. Iridium, palladium, rare earths, deep mantle silicates, isotopic reserves, every aquifer contaminated and the recovery timeline for each. Every tectonic plate destabilized and the seismic consequences measured across millennia. Every atmospheric degradation event caused by their operations and the centuries of remediation that followed. The biological cost, species lost, ecosystems collapsed, the population bottleneck that brought humanity to 40,000 individuals on an entire planet. The geological recovery data mapped against the original pre-extraction baselines, and the original Salvage survey assessment reproduced in full in their own language with their own classification codes. A promising carbon-based generalist unlikely to survive the extraction period. The attaché, according to the declassified report, allowed the fleet commander 40 minutes to review the data. The commander reviewed it in silence. His patches cycled through 3 distinct color phases during that time, which the translator noted but did not comment on. Then the attaché said, "We survived the extraction period. We recorded everything and everything it cost us. We have spent the time since your departure building a civilization capable of ensuring that no extraction occurs on this world again without our explicit, informed, sovereign consent. That civilization is what your sensors have been showing you since you arrived. You are not in danger. Your fleet is not targeted. But your extraction license is void. Your survey data is 200,000 years obsolete, and this world is not available for salvage. We will escort you to the system boundary and provide navigational data for your return transit. You are free to go." The fleet commander asked one question. "How long have you been expecting us?" The attaché said, "Since the day you left." There was, according to the report, a silence after that, not the confused silence of the initial sensor returns. This was different. This was the silence of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the nature of time and what it can produce when a species decides to use it deliberately. The commander's patches went through a color the translator had no standard label for. She noted it as unclassified, possibly archival recognition, meaning the commander may have been accessing something deep in Selethi cultural memory, some equivalent of the moment when you realize the story you've been telling yourself about the world is not just wrong, but has been wrong for longer than your civilization has records. The commander thanked the attaché. He used a formal trade standard construction that the translator said was typically reserved for interactions with entities of recognized superior standing. Then he ordered his fleet to prepare for departure. The return escort took 19 hours. The Selethi fleet ascended back through the corridor, reformed in high orbit, and was guided by the atmospheric fleet and the orbital grid to the system's outer boundary. 3 Kessler-class warships accompanied them for the full transit, maintaining formation at a distance that was courteous but unambiguous. The Selethi did not deviate, did not protest, did not request negotiation. Their comms traffic during the transit was sparse. The translation analysts described the dominant emotional register as reassessment, which I take to mean the slow, structural work of rebuilding your understanding of something you thought you knew. I watched the departure from the upper terrace until the fleet was too distant to see, then followed it on my tablet, by its data shadow, its fading drive signatures, the gradual return of baseline readings on the grid, like watching a storm system move away over the Pacific and the pressure normalize behind it. When the last Selethi drive signature crossed the boundary and their fleet entered deep transit, the Rannoch 4 alert was downgraded, then cancelled, and the defense grid returned to its standard passive posture, and the atmospheric fleet resumed its patrol patterns, and the Amber Wall's maintenance schedule reactivated, and my coffee was 12 hours cold, and the gulls were back on the updraft along their west face as though nothing had happened. I went back to Buttress 9 the next morning. The structural integrity report was still on my tablet where I'd left it. The expansion joints in the 9th column needed recalibration, a routine job 3 hours of careful measurement and adjustment, the kind of work that keeps a megastructure standing across centuries and is never dramatic and is always necessary. I picked up where I had left off, but I kept thinking about the Grainfather and the fleet commander whose patches had been cycling formal distress, and the 63 industrial ships that had crossed real distance. Decades in transit, crews in suspension, cargo holds empty and waiting, to collect from a world their records said was depleted and dead. I thought about the extraction crews, sitting in their staging bays next to equipment that had been calibrated for a planet that no longer existed, waiting for a deployment order that would never come. What had they expected? I tried to imagine it from their side. The transit, the long suspension, the waking, the briefing that said, "Today, we begin extraction on a deposit world, last surveyed 212,000. Years ago, mineral content 34% depleted, no significant indigenous resistance." The routine of it, the ordinariness, they had done this before, on other worlds, and it had always gone the way the survey said it would. The deposit world was where the file said it was. The minerals were where the scanners said they were. The local fauna, if any remained, kept its distance. And then the scanners came back with cities, with warships, with an orbital defense grid that had already locked on, with a wall running 4,000 kilometers along the coast of the shelf they had earmarked for future extraction. The shelf they hadn't gotten around to mining the first time. And the wall was bigger than anything they had ever built, and it was staffed, and it was watching them, and it had been watching the sky for a very long time. I thought about the carving in Central Africa, unlikely to survive. I have seen a reproduction of it in the Sverdlovsk archive. The lettering is clinical, precise, rendered in a standard Salathi industrial font. There is no malice in it. That is what makes it so heavy. The Salathi who wrote it were not being cruel. They were making a professional assessment, the way an engineer notes a load tolerance or a surveyor marks a boundary. They were noting, with the detached precision of people doing their jobs, that the life on this planet was not expected to persist through their operations, and they recorded it the same way they recorded the mineral yields and the extraction timelines, as data. They were almost right, but almost is the word that spans 200,000 years of, or almost is the gap between their assessment and the amber wall. Almost is the distance between unlikely to survive and 3 Kessler-class warships flanking your fleet on its way out of the system you came to. Strip. Almost is the reason we kept the ledger, not for revenge, not for litigation, not for any purpose as small as anger. We kept it because the record is the spine of readiness. You cannot prepare for what you do not remember. You cannot build against a threat you have forgotten. And you cannot look a returning fleet in the eye and say, since the day you left, unless you have the documentation to prove it. We remembered, generation after generation after generation, through dark centuries and golden ones, through collapses that could have ended the project and renaissances that could have made it seem unnecessary. We remember. The archive was maintained, the ledger was updated, the skills were preserved, the infrastructure was expanded, the readiness was renewed. Not because we knew the Salathi were coming back. We didn't, but because we knew someone might. The Salathi, or a species like them, or something worse, something we hadn't met yet and couldn't predict. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that the door would not be open again. That is not a boast. Standing on the amber wall that evening, watching the grid readings return to normal and the last traces of the Salathi's drive, signatures fade from the display, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindication. I felt the weight of the thing we had done, the sheer patient mass of it, the generations upon generations who had lived and worked and died inside the project of making this world unassailable, many of whom never saw an alien ship and never expected to, and who did the work anyway because the work was the point, the readiness was the point, not the test. The next morning I recalibrated the expansion joints on buttress 9. The readings were nominal. The amber wall settled into its specific foundations the way it always does after a thermal cycle. Slowly, with a faint harmonic I can feel through the soles of my boots, a vibration so low it is almost geological. I have felt it for 31 years. My predecessor felt it for 28 before me, and hers for 34 before her, and the line goes back a long way. And the harmonic has never changed, because the structure it moves through has never failed. I filed my maintenance report and walked the upper terrace in the early light. The ocean was flat and gray-green. The sky was clear. The atmospheric fleet was up there somewhere, invisible at altitude, running its patterns. The orbital grid was overhead, silent, watching. Somewhere beyond the system boundary, 63 industrial ships were heading home with empty holds, and a survey file that would need to be rewritten from the first line. I hope they update their records. I hope they note, somewhere in whatever archive the Celethi keep, that the deposit world in this arm of the galaxy is occupied, and has been occupied, and was occupied when they were here last, and that the species they assessed as unlikely to survive is still here and remembers, and has built a world that will not be taken from again. But if they don't, changes nothing. The amber wall stands, the fleet patrols, the grid watches, the ledger is maintained. We were ready before they came. We will be ready long after they are forgotten. That is the only entry in the record that matters.